The situation we find ourselves today, the value of debts is increasing, yet the size of the economy is reducing because of the devaluation. So we are in a very peculiar situation where we see a lot of debts values rising, yet the size of the economy is reducing. Perhaps the third and most important point I want to make is, Anne, it's exactly 6.5 decades past a century. On this day, the Popular Origin of Species by Charles Darwin was published. That was in 1859, The Origin of Species. Tonight, I'd like to talk about the origin of Nigeria's debt position based on external and domestic situation. So let's look at external borrowing, the origins from President Jonathan, President Buhari, and President Tinubu, first 1 year. June 2011 to June 2020 to June 2012 under President Jonathan, external debt went from $3 billion to $6 billion, a growth of $3 billion in the first year. Under President Buhari, external debt in his first year went from $7 billion to $11 billion, an increase in external debt value of $4 billion. The good news, even though we'll talk about the bad news later, the good news right now is under President Tinubu, we see a stability in external debt. We haven't seen a growth in the value of external debt. When he came in, it was $39 billion. This report shows that as at the end of the second quarter of this year, it is now $38 billion. So that's some of the good news.
But despite the government borrowing more money from external sources, we've also seen that the reported value of external debt has not in any way declined when you compare it to last year. So how do you explain this?
And so, yes, the government is borrowing money. So let's take a look at the facts. Yes, so total external debt, the government has been borrowing money externally, but here's how we want to look at it. It depends on how you look at it. If you look at the total, as at June 2023, it was $38.8 billion. Now it is $38 billion. However, if you look at the first two columns, multilateral and bilateral debt, we see a growth in those two values. So that's in 2023, multilateral debt was $16.9 billion. That increased to $17 billion. Bilateral debt as well increased the value from $5 billion to $5.4 billion. However, what has made the total external debt reduce are three reasons: commercial debt, promissory notes, and syndicate loans. So those are the reasons why, despite multilateral and bilateral debt growing, the reason why total external debt has declined in the last 1 year is because of the decline in the value of commercial debt, promissory notes, and syndicate loans. So that is the trick.
Beyond external debts, what is the status of the domestic debt of the federal government as we speak?
Now that's where there's bad news. And I'd like us to take a look at domestic debt. Yes, we've looked at external debt, and we've seen that hasn't really changed under the president in the first 1 year. However, if you look at domestic debt, there's a lot of reasons to be worried. First 1 year of President Jonathan, domestic debt went from 5.2 trillion naira to 6.1 trillion naira, an increase in the value of domestic debt under President Jonathan, 900 billion naira. Under President Buhari, increase in the value of domestic debt, 8.4 trillion to 10.6 trillion naira, an increase of 2.2 trillion naira. The challenge we have, Anne, is under President Tinubu, domestic debt has gone from 48.3 trillion naira to 66.9 trillion naira, an increase in the value of domestic debt of 18.6 trillion naira. What does 18.6 trillion naira mean in the last 1 year? In simple terms, in the last 1 year, the value of our domestic debt has been growing at an average of about 50 billion naira per day. That is what it means. But here's why a lot of people are worried. In the first half of the year, the revenue from the federal government, 3.8 trillion naira. However, money spent on debt service, 6.7 trillion naira. In the final analysis, my grandfather once told me, Jide, I know you want to.
That's an interesting part.
My grandfather once told me that he who lives on borrowed money lives on